Hello, everybody. So, apparently, yesterday, a friend of mine had the honor of of having some more famous YouTuber. My friend is a YouTuber. Well, she was a YouTuber. She doesn't really do it a whole lot now, but she had the honor of having a more famous YouTuber respond to one of her questions of apologetics. And of course, this other guy is an atheist, and he gets angry at her because he disagrees with her. So, and, and ultimately, I mean, that's what it amounts to. You could say, but he has good arguments and stuff. I would say, no, he doesn't. Anyway, I'll link his video in the description below when he does, or when I'm done with this. So this YouTuber's name is Mr. Atheist. That's his channel, I guess, and his name is Jimmy. So I don't know. I don't think he's ever going to see this. I don't think many people are ever going to see this. But if he ever does, hi, I'm Zeli. Nice to meet you. Um, so this guy, of course, like many other people, he was playing my friend's. Her name is V or Versavia. Um, her video in the background, sort of in the foreground, and then responding to it. Okay, cool. I don't do that because I don't have the technology for that. I'm a poor pauper. So I'm just going to read my notes from his video, and I took notes because he says a lot of things. Basically, this is going to be a theme of my criticism of his arguments. He says that her video sent him into a spiraling depression and that her arguments are unpalatable. And ultimately, that is why all of his arguments don't really matter, because it's a matter of taste, in other words. So, and I'll explain to this more. I'll explain this more. My friend V, what she was arguing is that slavery in the Bible is not what everyone says it was. First of all, she talks about slavery a little bit. Then she talks about the supposed um, forced rape, or sorry, forced marriage by the people who go in and conquer other lands. And then this guy, of course, he says, let's see, what did he say exactly? Um, 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 Basically, don't really see it on my notes, so I guess I didn't write it down. But anyway, he says that that sort of God, he, is an immoral God. So let's examine that really quickly, because that has a couple premises inlaid into it. So first of all, let's assume that that all of what he's saying is true. That God actually condones rape and slavery, and this forced marriage, which he doesn't. Scholars say so, but let's assume he does. So 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 it's a non sequitur that to say that God is immoral, even if you don't agree with his morality, because ultimately, nobody is throughout history, nobody has ever agreed with his morality, really. So you're just like you're just one more guy, and so let's get started here. In order to say that the God of the Bible is immoral, you have to assume a couple things. First of all, you have to assume he doesn't exist. Second of all, you have to assume that you know better than those people who wrote the Bible, or whoever wrote the Bible. So I'm not going to argue about his existence, like whether or not he exists, because that'll take way too long. But let's suppose, for instance, that you think that you know better than those people back then. If God doesn't exist, what basis do we have for any sort of objective morality? None. Actually, that's the answer. So ultimately, if you have some sort of, if God doesn't exist, if there's no sort of framework to base your objective morality on, then it's really just a matter of taste. Like, we have our morals, they have their morals. They're sort of just there, and it's a matter of opinion, really. Like, well, who cares? You know, we disagree with them, so whatever. And then we can narrow that down even further. Like, I disagree with this guy regarding his characteristics or characterizations of God and being immoral, and his characterizations of morality in general. So, how do we compare which one is better? We could say, like Sam Harris argues that it's in our there's something about nature that's moral, because I don't think he's a complete reductionist, but basically the argument is like nature, or we can find morals in nature, and this is Richard Dawkins' argument as well. And but Sam Harris says we must rise above our nature, which is really interesting coming from a someone who thinks that we are all purely determined. But anyway, what sort of model would we then produce from nature? Like, if morals come from nature, like if we're talking purely materialistic, which I don't know if this guy is a materialist, but let's assume that we're he is a materialist. I'll assume he is and he isn't. If he is a materialist, that means that we have to find morals in nature. Actually, morals are just sort of descriptions of what people normally do, ultimately, or that would be a norm, and then you'd have to then infer morals from the norms of society, of the animal kingdom, etc. So, where do we get this sort of like how can we then take one animal's instincts and then compare it to another animal's instincts and say one is better than the other? Well, we can't really. Like, ultimately it's just a matter of opinion. And then I find this with every single version of this, because we can argue that maybe morals don't come from nature, but they come from reason. But then again, you have the same problem. You have one person's reason and another person's reason. So how do you decide which one is better? Uh, and and that it you need in the end some sort of uh, objective outside of humanity framework to base morality on, and so that's why we need God. You could say, even if you argued that morality came from something that was non-personal, okay, that'd still be God, um, as long as it's whatever created the universe, you know. So let's start talking about what he said now. So he talks about how in the Bible, some of the worst things humans have ever done are described. Sure, yeah, but they're not condoned. Immorality is bad. So the things described are bad for the well-being of all humanity, of mankind. Which, okay, now we're getting sort of a where he bases his ideas off of. This is an idea that I heard espoused by Sam Harris first. He was talking to Jordan Peterson, and he was saying morality, and I guess this is in his book. Morality can be inferred from our description of whatever the best possible world is versus the worst possible world. And so, him being a humanist, and this guy also being a humanist, because he says so in this video that I'm going to link, uh, we can assume that morality comes from this dichotomy between the best and worst possible worlds, and then we all have to sort of agree to it. So they basically, what Sam Harris says is, if you don't agree to that, like, evil is the worst possible situation uh, done to as many people, or the most suffering done to as many people for the longest period of time possible. If you don't agree that that's bad, then we just don't have any framework in which we can have a discussion. Okay, and that's fine. But from there, and so I'll premise this. I do agree that that would be bad, and God does too. But from there, it's sort of when you say that if you can't sort of form a discussion, you can't bridge that gap between someone who doesn't believe that and someone who does. That basically means that that's where your leap of faith is. That means that there's that underneath that there's no foundation for it. It means it's like a tree planted firmly in midair. So let's assume then God does exist. Because I don't think we're going to go anywhere if we're discussing about whether God does not exist, because you can't really have any basis of objective morality unless he does. And if you don't have any basis of objective morality, then you can't really criticize him because it's just your opinion. Anyway, let's assume he does exist for instance, and let's assume that he did say all the worst possible things that this guy is saying. And the answer would be, so, you know, God created morality. Like morality emanates from him. So if he created the universe and he also is the dictator of what morality is, that sort of means that the universe runs on his laws. I mean, not necessarily, but it's kind of the next natural step in reason. Okay, but well, there's the criticism that was expressed to Socrates. I think it was Socrates. What about the objection that, like, what if God created it? You have this these two questions. If God created, sorry, how do you frame this? If morals come from God, or if God is the one who gives morality, you have to either assume that one, God invented morality, or two, that there's something outside of God that is morality in general. And this is something that God would have to draw on in order to give it to us. Now, Christians have already answered this for like 1500 years at least. But let's assume the premises. Like, okay, let's assume that God just invents morality arbitrarily. He still invented the world arbitrarily. Like, so, it just follows sort of naturally that if he invented morals arbitrarily and he invented the world arbitrarily, that they sort of go together. Like they're both run on the same basic principles, which means the laws of morality still are in operation in the world. Now you'd have to assume then, in order for us to say that the God of the past or the God that wrote the Bible is immoral, you'd have to assume that God actually changes his morality. And so I would say that that takes, first of all, I would say that that takes a bit more faith to assume, because if we're assuming that God chose these morals arbitrarily, you there's no real reason for him to change that. But so it's a bit more of a leap of faith to say that he would. Um, but let's say he does just change them. In which case, we could say that he was wrong back then, because he would be telling us that he was wrong back then, or at least that he just changed morals. And in which case, he wasn't really wrong. He just sort of changed things. And honestly, I don't have an answer for that. I would have to sort of ruminate on that one a little bit. Maybe I'll come back to that later. But anyway, it's easier to assume that God doesn't change. Like if he chose those morals, there's no reason for him to change them in the future. But even if he chose them arbitrarily, they still are in effect in this world, which means they are still the morality of this world. Okay, but let's assume then that he took them from somewhere else. And what we could then come to the conclusion is that he's been around sort of longer than us. He kind of has a different, a higher perspective than us. And okay, so maybe he did take them from this other realm, and let's say he took them imperfectly. That's just the same objection applies to the previous one. Like he still created this world based on those morals, and again we're assuming that he created this world. Now, if we are to assume that he didn't create this world, that something else created this world, then maybe the world of that other morality created this world, and then he sort of just is next to to that other morality realm or something, then this world would then operate on those other morals that created the world, and he would sort of just have to dictate, not dictate, but he would have to govern this world based off of those and based off of this, and then we could say like maybe he could be wrong on something, but we would never know actually because he still has higher authority than us, because we would assume that he's the governor of the world, and so I don't see what this really like. I don't see how this. How can I say this? I was going to say something. I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, let's skip that part because ultimately it comes down to the same thing. You um, either God invented morals, in which case this world still operates according to those morals, or he chose morals from somewhere else and then he created the world and therefore they still operate according to those morals that he chose, even if he got them wrong. Or he took morals from something else and this other something else created the world, in which case, okay, sure, maybe he could be wrong. But then you'd also have to assume that uh, this other thing. You just have to make a lot of assumptions first of all with that one, because even according to Plato and Aristotle, that's not really something that you can actually come to any sort of conclusion based off of just reason and logic, because that would mean that there are two gods, and that would mean that the world operates under multiple different rules or laws. In which case, you can't assume any sort of uniformity in the universe whatsoever. So that's kind of a problem because then we can't do any sort of inductive reasoning or inferences based off of what normally happens in the world. So let's sort of, and then Aristotle and Plato, they would both argue that God needs to be the thing that is all encompassing. God needs to be it's absolutely necessary that God is what created the world and is what created morals, if we're to assume that morals are created. But of course, the Christian answer is always that morals are just part of God's nature, and God created this thing called morality, but He can't necessarily just change that. And then He created this world, presumably based off of what He told us in the Bible about regarding those morals. So anyway, that's sort of just any sort of argument on morality against God is sort of just like, I don't know, it's like a child uh, saying that their parents are unfair because a child thinks that they know better than their parents. So I don't see I don't see how any of this follows. But anyway, he says that there were genocides in the Bible. Okay, first of all, we have to understand those documents from those times past. It's very typical in wartime documents to have some sort of hyperbole, and I know people are going to say, "But wait a second, you mean we don't read the Bible literally like the way that we would read it naturally?" No, because we weren't them, and they would have read all of those words differently than we would read it now. Sure, there are some things that we can say are pretty close to how we would read it, but that doesn't. It's like my friend said, and it's like this guy said, you have to put yourself into their shoes in order to really understand what the words meant when they were being said. So they used a lot of hyperbole in wartime rhetoric, like kill every last man, woman, and child. Except that didn't happen. Even in the biblical story, uh, in Joshua, Rahab was spared. Another city was spared. When they stopped, they stopped taking over things, and then God says, "Why have you not run them all out?" That's interesting phraseology. Maybe if we put ourselves into their shoes, run them all out means slaughtered them all, but that's certainly not what you think of when you think like that sounds more like, why didn't you scare them all off? Okay, anyway, that's in Joshua. You guys can read it. Moral instincts. So this guy bases a lot of, I suppose, his arguments on his moral instincts because that's reliable. Humans and moral instincts are really good. So let me take it. Let me then assume that all the people throughout the ancient world actually did believe that slavery was good. Are we supposed to trust their moral instincts, or are we supposed to trust your moral instincts? And if we're supposed to trust your moral instincts, why? Why? Because we're from the 21st century, and we believe in reason and logic and stuff. Right? Except most people don't even know reason and logic. I mean, it sounds like this guy doesn't either. But so reason and logic, regardless, even if they were primitive and we were modern, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean that they were wrong. It just means that we're different, that we have different tastes than them. We have different understandings of morality, and so there's no possible way to criticize them. Okay, the great moral authority. Oh yeah, that's what I was trying to quote before. Humans have learned to be more moral than God. Well, I mean, this is just again, it's silly. Slavery. Okay, so he's talking about slavery next, and then he says that there was a lot of bloodshed over the slavery, and then we had like a whole civil war over it, and the only way that Christians were able to conscience getting rid of slavery, or to sort of argue for getting rid of slavery based on scriptures, is they had to invent this new Christian interpretation, this reinterpret the Bible to argue against it. But that's sort of just not true. Like, if you actually read Jewish and Christian literature on these topics, they're definitely, like, they don't outright abolish slavery, but they definitely don't condone it. In fact, even on this one scripture, Rashi, who is the Jewish authority on the literal interpretation of scripture, he says on the one that's in question right now, where women are taken into captive, he says that the reason that her nails are cut and her hair is shaved is so that he won't like her, and then let her go free, because it was wrong for him to be going off of his base desires in the first place. And Rashi's like in the 11th century, something like that. So I don't know. Like, this atheist interpretation is just, I don't find it convincing. So he says that being in a life of slavery versus being killed, he doesn't know which one he would choose. Like, maybe he would choose life, but maybe it's just as bad to be a slave than to be killed. Okay, I mean, that's his opinion, sure. I don't find any qualms with that. Maybe he would just, if he was in that situation, he'd rather be killed. So their version of slavery is not what apologists say. Like, okay, so my friend said that their version of slavery was sort of just like servanthood, which, that's true. If you do any sort of research into any sort of slavery back then, like rudimentary research, like read any article on on uh, on the Egyptian slavery, which is really the more important one because they just came from Egypt, according to the narrative. But you can also read Babylonian slavery. Babylonian slavery was a bit more brutal than Egyptian slavery. Egyptian slavery was a type of slavery where you could dwell in their house and then rise up in the ranks and pretty much own your master's house. Like, read the story of Joseph, and that pretty much explains what can happen. Of course, you were definitely not seen as a human, but that's why God comes and he corrects it by saying you can't just kill these slaves because they are humans. Uh, so, so for instance, God actually condemns to death anybody who kidnaps another person in order to make them slaves, and he condemns to death anybody who buys somebody who was kidnapped in order to be a slave. So wait, what? If you're not kidnapped to be a slave, how can you be a how why would there any slaves exist? Well, you would sell yourself into slavery. That's what would happen. And this isn't just me talking. This is actually scholars. Like I was watching this lecture series from this Yale professor, and what she was saying was, yeah, that's what would happen. You would just the typical version of slavery was you would just sell yourself into slavery. And of course, this isn't always what happened, but that's what would happen. But then you could ask, why would you sell yourself into slavery? Wasn't slavery terrible and horrible, and you could be beat to death? No, that's not what slavery was back in those days. It was basically servanthood. For instance, in the Bible, it says that if you beat your slave and they lose a tooth, then they go for free. Which is actually, honestly, is way better than in the Code of Hammurabi or the other uh, ancient texts of slave that talk about slavery. Second of all, that means you can't. Oops. So that was weird. Okay, so there are multiple ways of interpreting this. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's something that was interpreted a long time ago by Jews. Um, to mean that you can't, that if you knock someone's eye out, you have to compensate them with some sort of monetary, like whatever the value of an eye would be. And maybe this was different in the Code of Hammurabi, which, the Code of Hammurabi says that too. But what this does is it changes the scope of the conversation. It means that like eye for an eye, tooth for tooth can be talking about monetary stuff. So like let's say you knock someone's eye out and you have to compensate them in monetary value. What if you cause there's some you do something that causes them to be unable to create that same amount of monetary value that is valued to their eye? Okay, well then now you have this new sort of meaning because eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth can mean first like actual organs. Second, it can actually just mean you are reducing someone's capacity to make money. So, what does that mean? A slave? You knock their eye out, you knock their tooth out? We can actually frame that based off of how they would have framed it in the sense of monetary gains. So, wait a second, slaves made money? Of course they made money. Back in those days, they had like slavery was basically a job. It's like a job from the 20s or the 1850s, which didn't have a whole lot of like it was pretty bad, but um, it still wasn't like slavery in the 1850s. And then again, as I said, you can't kidnap a guy to be a slave, which means the slavery that was here in the U.S. was most of those people that owned slaves would have been put to death according to the biblical code. And then it says in I think it's Numbers 21. Sorry, Exodus 21. Then it says, if a slave runs away from their master and you house them, you're not supposed to give them back to their master. Ooh, oh. So in other words, in the U.S., if someone ran away from their master, if a slave ran away from their master, you were supposed to give them back. In the Code of Hammurabi, if a slave ran away from their master and you housed them, you'd be put to death. In God's code, if a slave runs away from his master, you have to house them. You have to get them away from their master because their master is cruel and harsh. So, like, there are at least 3 different laws saying you can't beat them in general. And then there are also laws that say if a slave loves his master and loves what everything his master gave him, then he can serve him forever. Wait a second, what? So if you can a slave can love their master? But wait, I thought slavery was terrible and cruel and you would never want to be a slave. You would prefer death over slavery. Well, apparently not. Some slaves loved their masters. And then you could also argue, I think this guy does. Uh, okay, so let me get back to this guy's argument. Their version of slavery equaled like beating and and breaking of teeth and and causing to die in 3 days or so. No, it wasn't. That's just like that isn't even a reading of the Bible. That's like maybe if he was the one who was reading the Bible and he was the one who was trying to put the biblical stuff into interpretation and use, then he would do that. I mean, what does it say about his character? But I don't know anybody who would do that. And they didn't do that in those days. Okay, so then he says girls are grouped as property. They're basically property. Like a wife has no rights. I actually don't know a whole lot about that in terms of the historical context, but I've heard from scholars that that's not really the case. Especially this Yale lecture. The Sure, in like the Code of Hammurabi, girls didn't have any rights. In the Egyptian laws, girls, well, they did have rights actually in the Egyptian laws. In the Hittite and Assyrian laws, if I remember right, those girls didn't have any rights. But no, in the Egyptian laws, in the Israeli laws, girls did absolutely have rights. They weren't seen as property. In fact, you can know this because you can read the first or second chapter of the book of Genesis. Well, what does it say? In Genesis 1, the creation of mankind, he created man and woman in the image of God. And throughout history, Christians and Jews, all throughout history, like since the day they got this from Mount Sinai, um, since that very day, they were uh, interpreting this to mean that women are essentially equal to men. Now, not in the same way that we think of it today, of course, but they did have equal value. And and then in the second chapter, you can say, but she came from his rib. But, have you ever actually read what the commentator said about this? Commentator said, one, she didn't come from his head so that she can rule over him. In other words, she's not above him. She didn't come from his foot to be stomped down by him. In other words, she's not beneath him. She came from his chest, which means she's supposed to be loved and protected, and all this cool stuff. Okay, so she's equal to him. That's basically what that's saying. And then you even get in the Bible, in the law, a bunch of stuff that says, even if you hate your wife, you shall not mistreat her. You shall not reduce the food that you give her, the wifely things that you're supposed to do for her, which people interpret as sex, which maybe that means sex, but it definitely doesn't only mean sex. And you shall not neglect to clothe them. In other words, you're supposed to love them. And this, of course, is also the interpretation in the New Testament. Okay, next. The version of slavery. Don't know what that note means. I forgot what that note meant. Many cases where that happened. Yeah, so he says that there are many cases where the worst possible interpretation happened, which, yeah, actually, that's what the Bible says. It says that throughout most of Israelite history, they were not operating according to the law of God. But that doesn't mean the law of God is unjust. That doesn't mean God is unjust. That just means that the people in the Bible and throughout Christian history too, which this is another critique about that this guy had, is that if Christians were in charge of, like, had their way, then a lot of our modern interpretations would be out the window. Which, yeah, sure, but that doesn't say anything against God, first of all, and second of all, um, that's just not true. Like, there are periods throughout history where Christianity and Judaism were sort of in at their worst, but then there are also a lot of periods where they're at their best. Like, they properly interpreted these scriptures, and you can tell that because the Talmud exists, which is 1,500 years of debate regarding the proper usage of this law, and you have all this Christian theology as well. So I don't know. I would just do some more research about that first, and I don't know everything about that, so I might be wrong. But anyway, from my understanding, there have always been periods where Christianity has been at its worst and it's been at its best, as well as Judaism. So then he says, in another world, thee and I could get along, but not in this world, because in this world she is indoctrinated by the church to have to dogmatically hold to an old book that uh, in which she has to take the most reprehensible human activity and find some sort of way to make it okay, which, maybe that's a legitimate criticism to some people. Um, but if you actually read the Bible in its historical context and in our historical context with a clear lens and uh, actual training in argumentation and logic and stuff and reason and philosophy, then pretty much every single one of his arguments they just go out the window. Ultimately, the type of argumentation that he's using is not the type of argumentation that proves Christianity wrong. It doesn't prove Judaism wrong. It doesn't prove the Bible wrong. Its purpose is just to make people blush. Really, that's what it is. It's framing the Bible in such a way that it makes it seem wrong in our current context. And again, that's just like saying we don't like what those guys do. It's like Americans and Mexicans have very I don't mean Mexican people. I mean Mexico and America. They have different laws, and that's like an American saying Mexico, their laws really are immoral, and then Mexico saying, America, their laws are really immoral. Um, and this basically what's happening here. Really, is this guy? He just says God is immoral because I don't agree with him. In another world, I could get along with V, but I don't agree with her. Therefore, I can't. Seriously, people should grow up. Okay, that's probably it for today. Have a good night and Shabbat Shalom. I'm not Orthodox.